Distortion. Perhaps not the sexiest of topics, but if we're going to make our amplifiers sound good, we're going to need to know how it works, and most of all, what it sounds like. Now, there's many different types of distortion, and a lot of them I'm not going to discuss here, but I'm going to discuss the main types, the ones that really matter, namely harmonic distortion, phase distortion, intermodulation distortion, which is also known as heterodyning or beating, amplitude distortion, or basically bandwidth distortion. I'll get into harmonic distortion. All it basically is you have an amplifier or some kind of system, takes in an input, a single basic signal, and you have that input signal plus some added harmonics at the output. As you can see, I've tried to make that sine wave decidedly misshapen to indicate that there's added harmonics. It misshapes the signal. And you can think of this like the harmonic series, where it's the fundamental plus 2 times the fundamental plus 3 times plus 4 and so on and so forth. But every time they get smaller and smaller, like the harmonic series here. So the second harmonic would be 1/2 the amplitude of the first, and then a third, and so on and so forth. And so it looks visually kind of like this, where it's going up in frequency but down in amplitude. And if you were to take this series of all sine waves and put them together, you'd get a sawtooth wave, basically. And of course, all the phases of each of these get adjusted and get basically every possible kind of wave you can kind of think of can be generated in this way. That's the whole idea behind harmonics and Fourier and all that. There's a whole mathematical discussion on Fourier alone. I'm not going to get into that. A square wave is basically all odd order harmonics. Odd order being the first, third, and fifth. And it creates the square wave shape. As you can see, if you sum together all of them, it looks more like a square with edges that are straight up and down. But as you get with like 11 harmonics odd harmonics up to the 11th, you get an almost square wave. It looks kind of like one. But the important thing to note is that's what's called symmetric clipping. Meaning, if you were to take a sine wave and clip it symmetrically on both sides of the axis, it would look a lot like that. Now, clipping is basically that. It takes part of the sine wave and cuts it off. And if you were to overdrive an amplifier, for instance, it would do what's called it would do this because you run out of headroom, or for whatever reason it distorts the sine wave by clipping it. And in that process of clipping, it generates these harmonics. Hard clipping tends to generate higher order harmonics, whereas soft clipping tends to generate only lower order, like a second or third harmonic, as opposed to like 11th or 12th. Asymmetric clipping creates mostly even harmonics because you're taking off only one part of the sine wave and not equally both on each side. And yeah, like I said, hard clipping is higher order, soft clipping is lower order. And a square wave, like I said earlier, is all odd order harmonics. Now, what do they sound like? This is the important part. Higher order tend to stand out. They're much more harsh sounding usually. Lower order harmonics tend to fatten up the sound, makes it sound more like a chord. Like the third harmonic, for instance, is actually the perfect fifth, but a few octaves up. And the fifth harmonic is actually the perfect third, but a few octaves up. So if you put the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth together, you've basically generated a giant chord. Odd order harmonics tend to sound crunchy, and are usually undesirable. they're like associated with pentodes and transistors, push-pull amplifiers. Push-pull amplifiers cancel out the even order harmonics, but they retain the third order and fifth order ones. So they're very noticeable when they come on, and as you'll hear in the demonstration, they sound almost raspy. Even order harmonics sort of just fill out the landscape, because if you think about it, it's just octave after octave. So it's a lot more tonally pleasing, per se. Now, on to the demonstration. So I found this waveform generator to help us understand what harmonic distortion sounds like. So this is, you can add in all the harmonics at whatever phase you want. Now you can go ahead and add in see what that's done to the wave. So if you see an amplifier with that kind of clipping, it's going to give a little warmer sound. A little bit of third harmonic in there, as opposed to. So you can hear how easily higher order harmonics affect the sound. Now, as you can hear, the higher up you go, the more sort of annoying it gets, if you will, and the more it starts to look like a square wave. Now, intermodulation distortion is otherwise known as beating or heterodyning, like I said earlier, and this is the one they use extensively in RF. This is how they get what's called the intermediate frequency. You can convert frequencies up and down, but in audio, it's usually not very desirable, and it usually comes up from speakers, usually magnetic type speakers where you have a speaker cone, and if you put a few number of different types of frequencies on there, you'll get all kinds of intermodulation products. I'll show you what all that means in a moment. Amplifiers with negative feedback. Any nonlinear amplifier summing one or more signals. Negative feedback is basically that. So basically what you have here is you have two different frequencies, some nonlinear summation, and then you get sum and difference frequencies from those two. And in RF, one of these two is usually filtered out, and you get the one you want. But in audio, it's all within the audio band, and you can't really do that. And here's an example. So if you have 100 hertz and 200 hertz, one being the octave of the other, you have the sum, which turns out to be the third harmonic, which I said earlier is the perfect fifth. And the difference happens to be the same as the fundamental. So as you can see, depending on the frequency, it may not be so bad. However, if you were to put in there two frequencies that were not very related, you get sum and difference frequencies that are just so completely different, it would sound very, very bad very quickly. Now, the negative feedback problem is the crux of this whole issue. And basically, if you don't know what negative feedback is, it's basically where you take the output of an amplifier and sum it back to the input. That's a summation symbol. To correct, it does a whole lot of things. It helps correct distortion and frequency response and all kinds of stuff, and it helps reduce distortion, kind of. And here's why you have to be careful. Because without feedback, the amplifier has a finite gain, or has a finite bandwidth, I mean. It's only flat up to a certain point, and then you have roll-offs that drop the gain. And near the top of the audio band, it's inevitable that you're going to have less gain. That's just how amplifiers work, most of them, without negative feedback anyway. And the problem is then you don't have as much gain to turn into negative feedback to cancel out those upper harmonics. If you think about it, if you were to take 300 hertz again and feed it back in, sum it again with 100 hertz, you get 400 hertz. Now you think, that's the fourth octave, that's not too bad. Well, you do that a few number of times until you run out of gain and you can't cancel out those harmonics anymore. Well, then you have some nasty sounding harmonics, low amplitude mind you, but still nasty sounding harmonics up here where your ear can hear them the most, but the amplifier can't take care of them. The feedback loop doesn't have enough gain to be able to take care of these. So you have to be real careful. So the net effect is basically that the lower order harmonics are canceled, but the higher harmonics are added. So this is why some transistor amplifiers sound harsh, is because when you go to crank the volume on that thing, it just sounds harsh. And this is one of the reasons why. It's because the frequencies where the human ear is most sensitive, there's more harmonics. Intermodulation distortion tends to sound harsh and gritty, and it's pretty noticeable if there's like above a certain value. It's not like harmonic distortion is really only noticeable if it's a lot of odd order, but intermodulation is even more noticeable, and it really depends on the signals involved. But if, like, for most music, it's complicated enough that it's not good, and it's almost always undesirable unless it's an RF application. Phase distortion, basically all that means is the amplifier phase shifts certain parts of the audio band, and certain frequencies, due to the feedback loop, again, are going to get either, or by some mechanism, are going to get canceled partially or completely. And again, speakers are another culprit of this. Rooms with bad acoustics, if you ever have any experience in recording, you'll know that some rooms just sound better than others. And this is one of those reasons, because at certain frequencies you get cancellations, and that's basically what phase distortion is. It's actually pretty simple. Or, a poorly compensated negative feedback network. Again, you gotta be careful if you're designing these things. You can't just flippantly add negative feedback and expect it to sound like gold. That's not how it works. Now, bandwidth amplitude distortion is probably by far the most simple. It's basically no amplifier intrinsically has a flat gain response over the whole audio band, usually. And due to the limited bandwidth, you've got certain frequencies that are erroneously attenuated. So, like up at the upper end of the band here, you don't have as much gain as you should, and you've got a little peak here. So basically, the signal coming in is going to sound a whole lot different than the signal coming out, and you can pretty much count that as distortion. Well, I certainly hope that helped you understand what distortion actually sounds like and what all these words mean.